Good evening, everybody. My name is Tomek Kołodziejczuk, and on behalf of, well, the world, and that's for you, on my own behalf, I'm doing this event tonight. So we got 30 seconds, 45 more to bring our guest. And who is it tonight? I'm hosting discussion between famous Bitcoin podcaster and famous Bitcoin evangelist, namely Stephan Livera. And on stephanlivera.com, you can see his work. You can listen to Stephan Livera podcast. He's a student of Austrian economy. He's a libertarian himself and very well known in the Bitcoin community. You can check his Twitter, Stephan Livera. But also the second guest is Mr. Yaron Brook. He used to be CEO of the Ayn Rand Institute. Now he's chairman of the board. And he's also a popular podcaster, great speaker, and objectivist. And I'm fan of both of them. Let me welcome guests so they can hear me as well. Hello, good evening, gentlemen. We are already online. The countdown has started, have finished, and our meetup has started. Good evening, Stephan. Good evening, Yaron. How are you?
Very good. Thank you, Tomek.
Doing very well. Thank you, Tomek.
Well, I'm very glad to listen to you and to talk to you tonight because I'm a fan of both of you. Consider myself almost Bitcoin maximalist and almost objectivist. And I found this topic to be, well, kind of crucial for both of the communities, and kind of the thing that I a little bit regret, that these two communities of libertarians, objectivists, these freedom philosophers do not cross so much with Bitcoiners. At least it did not used to, since like 1 or 2 years ago, since class of 2020 in the Bitcoin community began to libertarian itself and educate and philosophize so much more. But on the other hand, I do not see objectivist community, stacking sats. And I regret it not only because I am both Bitcoiner and objectivist, but also because I would like to see objectivists rich in the future, and I would also like to see the Bitcoin world and Bitcoiners to have a little bit more of philosophy background. So, well, I don't want to be cliche and start explaining what is Bitcoin or what is objectivism. I hope our audience already knows. But I have my first question to Mr. Livera, or let's talk with names. My name is Tomek. Stephan, do you, as a Bitcoiner or just as a person, do you have your own philosophy? Do you consider yourself some monism?
So I think I guess I'm more interested in the political philosophy aspect of it as opposed to the broader philosophical elements of it. And so for me, I just consider myself a libertarian. I'm in the Austro-libertarian camp. And so, I mean, for people who are interested, yeah, I'm in the camp of people who believe in anarcho-capitalism under sort of a similar style of thinking to like Mises and Rothbard and Hans Hermann Hoppe. So I'm coming from that school of thought, and then that informs some of my Bitcoin perspective as well, and why I think it's such an important thing in terms of giving us liberty and actually essentially restraining the size of the state. And I think that's quite an important thing. And I think we're moving into a world where that is going to become a reality. And like you, I share that goal actually of I really would like to have more liberty-minded people into Bitcoin, because I want these people to also be rich in the new world, right? I'd rather those people have the resources, because I think they will sort of push it in a better direction. So I'd say that's probably how I would summarize some of my own thought.
Are you at all familiar with Ayn Rand philosophy of objectivism, maybe?
Only loosely. So I obviously know there's, some relation there. And obviously Ayn Rand had some, interactions with many early libertarians. But I know there's also some conflict there in the sense of I think some objectivists really don't like libertarians. I understand that. But I would say I don't know a huge deal about the objectivist philosophy. Like I've read a couple articles here and there, maybe a few wiki pages, but I wouldn't say I'm, familiar with it.
Moving to Yaron, Mr. Brook, you are already a well-known financial author as well. So I guess you have your own financial strategies as you're a founder of a hedge fund. So maybe apart from the philosophy or Bitcoin, could you share with us your secret or what is your basic investment strategy?
No, I mean, why would I share that with anybody? I don't want competition. So, yeah, I mean, I am a managing partner at a hedge fund. I can't say too much about the hedge fund because we live in a world where, the various branches of government authoritarianism limits what we can say about these things. And if I am perceived as somehow marketing my fund, I could get into deep, deep trouble. And since I doubt there are very many investors here who could participate, I just would rather not get into that whole morass. But I'm a finance PhD. I was a finance professor for many years. The hedge fund is based on financial research I did as a professor. It's basically all in the equities market. I invest only in one area, which is very, 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 very not sexy, which is the way I like it because that's where I think you can make money. It's basically I invest in small banks in the United States. So I have my little niche, and it's quite a profitable niche, and I work to exploit that niche. So it's not exactly it's not that interesting, put it this way, in the context of this kind of discussion.
But have you considered maybe investment in Bitcoin?
No. No, for a number of reasons. One is I don't understand it. I tend to not invest in things I don't understand. One of the things I'm looking forward to today is for Stephan to educate me a little bit about Bitcoin, because I will admit that I am relatively ignorant of it. I don't understand it. I also don't know how to value it. That is, I am a finance guy. You show me an asset and I can give you an approximation of what I think it's worth if I put enough work into it, right? I can look at future cash flows, I can look at the risk, and so on, and I can tell you what it's worth. Bitcoin is in my view, this is my layman interpretation, right? My view, Bitcoin right now is a financial asset whose value is derived from the expectation that it will become money. But I'm not convinced that it will ever become money. And I think the probability that it actually does become money is fairly low, even if it was a good money, and I'm not even convinced of that. But even if it is, I think it actually becoming money, I think the probability is fairly low. And I don't know how to value that. So I could take 21 million Bitcoins divided by the total amount of money in the world and say it replaces every currency in the world and this is its value, and that would place its value much higher than it is today. Much higher than it is today, but then I'd have to accommodate the probability of that actually happening, and then multiple dimensions of that happening. One, is it a good money? Two, will governments allow it to happen? And we can have a discussion about whether it needs government to allow it to happen, but I think it does. And will markets allow it to happen? So they're kind of two different distinct things. Is there competition? What are the other competitors? Are there cryptocurrencies, who I understand even less than Bitcoin? Are they money? Will they compete with Bitcoin? To what extent does that affect Bitcoin's valuation? So I think there's massive complexity here. And at this point, I don't know how to deal with that complexity, and I don't know how to place a value on it, so I'm not an investor. Obviously, I should have been, because it's gone up. But there's a lot of things that I should have invested in, or as many people will tell you, over the last 50 years. I could, if I had, with hindsight, I should be a trillionaire right now, but the first trillionaire ever. But I don't have hindsight, so I have to be able to project into the future. And since I can't, I won't touch it.
Seems like we brought Stephan here to orange peel fellow objectivists and Yaron Brook. And orange peeling, for those of you who do not know, is like very quickly and deeply convert people to believe that Bitcoin could be the money of the future. Somehow Yaron does not believe it. Maybe it's not a matter of belief. Maybe there are some fundamental arguments, like within the nature of this cryptocurrency, of this asset, and maybe with the nature of the world and scarcity and why we need money and what do we need as money. Stephan, do you think, I mean, I know you
Sure.
do, But what would be your orange pill for Yaron?
Of course. So I think, Yaron, I think let's start with the question of what would make a good money. Like, can it be a money? I think the framework is important as well. So perhaps, Yaron, if you could outline to me what do you think makes a good money? Like, why do we hold it? And like, if you could just outline some of your thoughts around that, and then perhaps I can sort of respond with how I'm thinking about that.
Sure. So money is as Mises defined it, a commonly used medium of exchange. And why would somebody use something as a medium of exchange? It would have to have certain characteristics that would make it a desirable medium of exchange. And we can go over it would have to be divisible. Yes, Bitcoin and gold are divisible. It would have to be durable. Bitcoin and gold are durable, although I have some questions about Bitcoin's durability under certain circumstances. It would have to be recognizable. We know Bitcoin's very good at that. It would have to be portable. Yes, but again, there's some questions about that. It would have to be scarce. Obviously, Bitcoin is the most scarce because it has a finite number. So I get it. Although, if it's competing against other crypto, then is it scarce? That is, what do we measure the scarcity? Why is Bitcoin unique versus other cryptos who might be also scarce? But then you add up, if you add up the total number of not Bitcoins, but if you add up the total number of cryptos, is that number a scarce number? And why not? Why are the others not competition for Bitcoin? Why would we have one standard, not many? But I think the most important one is, and that's not in these five, and that is that it holds some value to the holder beyond acting as a medium of exchange. And Mises talks about this, right? That it is something that people value above and beyond the medium of exchange. Indeed, something like gold was valued first and then became a medium of exchange. That is, it wasn't designed as a medium of exchange. It was, people wanted it, and that's why they could exchange it for a cow. The reason you could exchange it for a cow was not initially because the person thought, oh, cool, I'll have money, but because they said, oh, cool, I want gold or silver, whatever the money was at the time. And I think this, of course, is the biggest problem, in my view, with Bitcoin is it doesn't have that. That is, it has no value, as I understand it. I'm willing to be educated, above and beyond its function as a medium of exchange, or as what people think will be a medium of exchange, because its ability to be a medium of exchange is still an unproven idea. Right now, it's just an asset. So that to me is what money is, and that to me is what Bitcoin is good at and what it isn't good at. I'll just say something about durability and portability. The challenge with durability and portability is, and I know this is far-fetched, right? But you very much depend on electricity for both. And I think I'm not a pessimist, in a sense that I don't think the world is coming to an end. But one of the reasons I hold gold is because I think there's a slight probability, it's very, very small, that the world will come to an end. That in a sense, certain areas, certainly Puerto Rico, we won't have electricity for a while. And while I know that if in Puerto Rico we don't have electricity because power was out after Maria, and it could be even worse next time, people will exchange goods for gold in such an environment. Bitcoin is basically worth zero in such an environment. There's no mechanism. So again, that would be a concern I had. It's dependability on electricity. But I think the issue of value is more fundamental and more important.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, let me speak to some of that as well. So the way I'm thinking about it, money is the most saleable or the most marketable commodity. That's the way Mango spells it out, and obviously Mises sort of takes from that also. And then that's where we get into this question of, the monetary qualities, things like divisibility, portability, scarcity, blah, 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 all of those typical things. And so the way I think about Bitcoin is it solves, in some sense, the problems that neither fiat or gold could achieve. And why do I say that? Because it's about salability through time and space. And so we can think of it like gold did solve that problem of salableness through time, but it was not able to achieve that goal of salableness through space, because in order for people to transact long distance, especially internet commerce, etc., you require a custodian. You couldn't do it in the same way. And then on the other hand, with fiat, obviously, yes, you can transact over distance. You can use the central banks, blah, 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 PayPal, whatever, credit card networks, but it's not saleable through time. You store your value in fiat and it's going down over time. You're guaranteed to lose money, basically. The security that you have is going down. So in that way, I think Bitcoin manages to sort of achieve the best of both worlds in a sense. And so I guess that's kind of high level how I would think of it. But I'm looking at it more like it's a settlement layer. We're not necessarily going to be doing every day-to-day transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain. We're going to use layers above that, and that's kind of the key concept. And I think you and your listeners probably are familiar with that idea.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
What you said. She said correctly, Menga says it's the most marketable commodity, and I think that's right. What makes Bitcoin a commodity?
So this is so we're kind of getting into this idea of, does something need to have a non-monetary use, right? And I think that's to your question that you were saying.
A commodity, it's something that has a use, not as money. That's what the commodity is. So Bitcoin, by definition, I think goes outside of Menga and Mises' framework for money. And maybe that's okay, but I think that's important to recognize.
So I would say it's kind of like they could never have foreseen this. Menga and Mises were writing pre the digital world. And so I think they could never have foreseen this. And the way I see it, it's more like, it's sort of like a digital commodity in a sense, but yes, you're right. It does not have so setting aside some of the less things like time stamping and so on. Yes, I think for the most part, Bitcoin doesn't have non-monetary use. So I think perhaps our disagreement then is more just that you think something needs a non-monetary use, and I don't think it does. I think there's a bit of a confusion.
Ethereum do have a non-monetary use and therefore could be maybe better than Bitcoin as money?
Sorry, say again, what?
Like Ethereum have a non-monetary use and maybe could evolve to be better money than Bitcoin ultimately because of that.
So for me, I would say no. The reason is it doesn't have the same characteristics or monetary qualities, if you will. It doesn't have like that same sort of scarcity and difficulty to change, right? They change Ethereum all the time. And so I think what matters more to people is when we're looking at monies and potential. So the way, I see it, and you probably agree on this point, is that everything out there is sort of competing to become money. And whichever one is best, there are differences in the salableness of these different things. And Bitcoin just tends to be, is that one that's the best one. And that's why I think longer term, it's going to win out, because it just has these qualities and it's hard to change. And whereas Ethereum does change, and it doesn't, and this kind of also comes into the question around altcoins, and do they somehow detract from the scarcity of Bitcoin? And to that, my answer is no, they don't. The reason is they don't have the same qualities of Bitcoin, right? So they're not as decentralized. They often make trade-offs where they're not really, and often the promoters of these coins are not really telling you about those trade-offs. And essentially, they have all essentially been proven that they can change a lot more easily than Bitcoin can. And the other important point is I think there's a network effect going on here. Because Bitcoin was first, there's a lot more Bitcoin holders. There's Bitcoin exchanges, there's developers, there's wallet software, there's you name it. People want to work on the best thing. And it's like, to me, I'm viewing it like it's like the creation of the internet. And then you got all these people coming along and saying, oh, well, I don't care about your internet. I'm just going to make internet too. And everyone is just going to use my internet too. And it's like, no, that's not really how this works. Like, people are joining the internet because they want to be part of this open monetary network. So that's the way I would frame it with Bitcoin. So I think the other thing, and even some in the Austrian world get hung up on this idea of, non-monetary use and saying, well, see, if it doesn't have anything, then it's going to collapse down. Or they might say something, looking at, say, the Mises regression theorem, where I think they are maybe misunderstanding that. Now, actually, in my recent episode with Bob Murphy, we went into this topic. And so I think there are different ways to go back to that point around regression theorem. One way to think of it is that in the early days, it was just nerds. It was just nerds online money, and they wanted to, whatever it was, 10,000 Bitcoins for 2 pizzas, or some of there were earlier transactions prior to that. But it was just a bunch of online, cypherpunks, crypto anarchists, libertarians, people who just wanted to play around. And from then on, it just grew. And so the prices, and I think there is a specific point where I believe, I think it's Rothbard or it could be Mises, but I think Rothbard makes the point where even if you were to sort of strip away the prices, even if you were to strip away gold's use, people could then proceed on the basis that they had already established some kind of monetary relations in it. And so I think the way I'm seeing it is that we are going through this process of adoption of Bitcoin. So at the start, it's going to be more like a store of value sort of thing, even though, yes, the canonical or quintessential element of it is that it is the best medium of exchange. But I think it'll just take time for that to prove out. So it'll start in kind of like a more of a store of value, collateral sort of sense. And then eventually more and more people will start to use it as their medium of exchange and as their unit of account. So that's how I'm seeing it.
What makes Bitcoin unique as compared to other coins, or somebody starting a Bitcoin competitor with similar characteristics? The network effect is real, obviously. But, there be network effects that are being replaced by superior networks. So network effects are not fixed and not metaphysically, necessary. And networks can be changed. And they in the world that moves at the speed that the internet moves, I think it's not that rare as people suggest. So in what way is it not possible to replicate the Bitcoin magic formula, if you will?
Yeah, interesting question. So I think you're right. The main argument, the main counter argument in my eyes is the network effect. But I would say it just comes down to, so it's that point that you can copy the code, but you can't copy that network of people who want to use that thing. And the way I see it is you can't just beat Bitcoin on in some small marginal sense on one dimension. You'd have to beat it on like multiple, and it needs to be convincingly better. It can't just be like a little bit better. It's like in our world, if you want to come out and beat something, you need to be like 10x better for people to actually switch over. And the other point is also that I think once things kind of hit a certain size, it's just hard to sort of overcome them. It's like how Facebook came up and Twitter came up and all these, Google came up. Like once they hit a certain level,
they replaced companies that everybody thought were going to be the winners because of the networking effect, right? So who would have believed sitting in 2000? I was there. So in 2000, who would have believed that these couple of kids running a private company called Google would beat Yahoo and a variety of really what looked like high quality search engines? And yet they did. And the same you could say with Facebook. I forget the name of the social network before that. It doesn't always. It sometimes happens much faster than one would expect it to happen. And the replacement happens, and sometimes just a little bit better is enough. If the marginal cost of switching or the marginal cost of getting new people is small enough, right? Is low enough. Then I'm not convinced. So I've seen enough technology evolution and studied enough evolution of technology to know that early on in the life of a technology, there are the people who are convinced that this is it, that it's over, that there's no competition. And 10, 20 years later, maybe it doesn't work out quite that way, and it's very, very hard, very, very hard to pick winners and losers early in an evolution of a technology.
Yeah, so I agree with you that certainly, it's not like, I think the company's example is probably not the best. I mean, it is an example, but I would say it's not. I think with money, we're talking about something with a network effect that is far, far stronger and far, far harder to dislodge. Your opportunity cost to hold one money versus another, like for me to hold more US dollars instead of Australian dollars, is much, much higher than for me, for example, to have a Facebook account and a Twitter account, or to use Yahoo and to use Google. Well, it's no big deal to me, but the opportunity cost for holding money is massive, right? It's a really, really big cost. So you really need to, like, the way I see it is you would have to really surpass it. And basically nobody has. And of course, it's not that people haven't been trying. There have been, what is it? I don't even know, probably 8,000 altcoins out there. How many times have people tried? And none of them have succeeded. So of course, people can try. I just don't think they'll be successful. I just think it's very, very, very unlikely that, of course, I guess I have to admit, yeah, it might be theoretically possible that someday someone comes out with a technology that's even better and someday surpasses it, but I haven't seen it yet. And
also,
I've been around. Yeah.
Not money, right? Not yet. It might become money. You're betting on the fact that it will become money, but right now it's not money because it's not used as a medium of exchange. It's very, very rare that it's used as a medium of exchange.
Well, I would say that that's
a Tesla with Bitcoin, but how many Teslas sell with Bitcoin? Very few. Because it doesn't make any sense to buy a Tesla with Bitcoin if you believe Bitcoin is going to go up in value, right? Right now, it's a speculative asset where people are holding it with the expectation they'll go up in value. It's not being used. And the only place it's being used as money is to get money out of countries that have capital controls. And maybe to transact in illegal activities. But it's very, very, I don't know what the actual volume of trade done in Bitcoin is, but my guess is it's tiny. And you couldn't call it a common medium of exchange.
I would agree that it's not a common medium of exchange today. But in certain communities, it can be. In the world of online gaming as well, there's a potential there that people will start using it for...
Potential, I agree. Saying actually right now, it's not money. Because nobody's using it as money.
I think it sort of depends on how you're defining money. But yeah, I mean, in the sense that, yeah, like it's not the global common medium of exchange. Okay, fine. I think that's...
No, it's not it's not a commonly used. Not commonly is small, right? Mises has two definitions of money, and I think money, credit, and banking. He says the universally, and then he changes it in human action to commonly used because he realizes they can't be universal. Bad money can also be money if it's commonly used. And Bitcoin right now is not commonly used. So I would say Bitcoin's not money. It's an asset that you expect to become money. That's how I would think of it if we are defining our concepts clearly.
Yaron, what would have to change? Like there are some pieces of nature of cryptocurrency or maybe size of the Bitcoin for you to like give it some hope and believe that, this finally can be a money of the free people and something that could replace central banking.
So I don't think it. Well, I think it's delusional in this to think that it will replace central banking unless we replace central banking. That is, my view is that that Bitcoin would become money if we had a truly free market, if we had no central banks, and I think it would lose in that competition because I think gold would be a better money. Gold, which was backed by electronic transactions, but you would store the gold somewhere with an intermediary who would store your gold, but we would all transact electronically. In a free market, I don't see the reason why Bitcoin is a better money than gold. But I think the challenge you have is that as long as there are central banks, and as long as there are governments, and as long as governments want power, they won't allow Bitcoin to become money. As soon as Bitcoin makes significantly inroads into money versus into a speculative asset, I think as long as it's an asset, central governments don't care that much. When they start seeing massive transactions in it and it starts replacing dollars or yuan or whatever the currency is, then they care because now they're losing control, right? The whole point of central bankers is control. It's not efficiency. It's not anything. It's to control the economy. They want control of our lives. That's the purpose of central banking. And, if they feel like they're losing that control, they will ban Bitcoin. Now, I know they can't literally ban it without turning off all the electricity, but they can ban you buying physical goods with it. That is what they can do is they can ban Tesla from selling Teslas to people with Bitcoin. They can ban the grocery store from accepting Bitcoin as a medium of exchange. They can ban its ability to perforate through the economy and become a currency. And so I don't believe it becomes a currency, or at least I think there's massive political risk to it becoming a currency because I think governments are far more powerful than Bitcoiners. On the one hand, they tend to be libertarians and they tend to view government with suspicion. On the other hand, they tend to think governments don't have that much power because Bitcoin can beat them. I don't think technology beats government. I think government beats technology. The only thing that can beat government are ideas, better ideas. So, and this goes to the kind of the title of our thing. I think the battle needs to be an ideological battle. And then in a free market, I'm happy to see competition between different monies and let the best money win. And that would be cool. But we're not there, and we're not going to be there in my lifetime.
So let me respond to a couple of those points. And certainly interesting points, Yaron. I think the point around government being able to stop Bitcoin, I think at this point they couldn't stop it, but they could regulate it. They could certain countries could try to ban it. And let's just note here, by the way, certain countries that have tried to ban it or regulate it, they've seen a spike in the peer-to-peer trade volume on Bitcoin. So in some cases, we've seen that when they try to ban Bitcoin or try to regulate it out of existence, they end up indirectly, they're telling people, hey, there's a reason you should be interested in Bitcoin, or you should be thinking about this thing, because there is actually a reason why you can save your value in this thing. Also,
so what do you mean by peer-to-peer exchanging Bitcoin?
Local, trade platforms, Bitcoin
so
for cash.
Buying Bitcoin. Buying and selling.
Buying or trading Bitcoin. We're seeing volumes rise in certain countries where this.
Would you agree with me
happens.
that they can stop you exchanging Bitcoin for physical stuff? Because they control the physical world.
So I think that's a question of how much enforcement they could do and how much ideological support Bitcoin has won by the time that becomes a serious consideration. I think in some sense it might be like Uber, right? So Uber, obviously that same example of, you got the taxi medallions and you got the government regulations, and yet Uber still managed to sort of get a foothold in many markets, even though they were probably illegal in many markets they were operating in, but they managed to sort of win enough people over that it didn't matter. I think it's a similar story with Bitcoin, that we're going to see people.
There's a sense in which maybe that's true, but remember, I mean, how much does government have invested in taxi medallions? Maybe a little bit, but no politician is going to fall on his sword over that. Central banks, that's a hub of power that is greater than any other hub of economic power in an economy. That is, government care more about their ability to manipulate and control their currency than maybe any other single activity other than taxation. So I don't think they're quite going to be willing to fall on their swords as rapidly as they did with Uber. And I would note that I forget the name, IB5 or whatever it was called in California, was a pretty significant attempt to regulate Uber. It was quite successful, even though it's been somewhat reversed, only somewhat. It's still a form of regulation over Uber, and that's just the beginning. Potentially, right? It could be a lot more. Plus, and this is, I think, important, people see the immediate benefits of Uber. Everybody uses Uber, like it's self-evident. I don't think the obvious benefits of a Bitcoin are quite as obvious. Even relatively smart people like me and people who are pretty astute in finance don't quite get it. The common person, for common people to use Uber, to use Bitcoin and care about Bitcoin as much as they, I mean, for most people, until the dollar collapses, the dollar is pretty cool. I mean, it's pretty fine. They can transact pretty much with anything. Yeah, it loses its value a little bit, but their wages go up as well. Their Social Security checks are linked to CPI. So yeah, when everything goes bankrupt, there'll be a rush to an alternative. I think common people, again, the masses who use Uber are much more likely to see the value in maybe gold than they are to see the value in something abstract like Bitcoin. Again, maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't see why anybody would fight. I mean, your community will, because your community is unbelievably passionate and unbelievably invested in it, but your community is still pretty small.
By global standards, yes, the number of Bitcoin users is probably something like 1% of the world, right? Or something like 1 or 2%. We're talking in that range.
Well, and how many of them are passionate and understand what they're doing?
Yeah, of course, many less than that. And I think for me, the way I would frame that really is that we're just that early that a lot of people still haven't. And I can understand some of that. And I mean, even for you, you're a smart guy. It's not that you, haven't heard the argument for Bitcoin. It's that you are you still want a bit more time for it to be proven out. And I can understand that. It's Bitcoin. the white paper came out in 2008. The network started in 2009. Here we are in April 2021. And, what is that, 12 years or so? It's still early days, but to me, it's sort of like looking at a young, Kobe Bryant or a young Michael Jordan and being like, look, see, he's not already gone and won all the world championships yet. Well, hang on, this kid's only 12 years old, right? It's like, and he's already like an incredible phenomenon. It's gone from 0 to 1 trillion. And it's like there are millions of people all around the world using it to transact. And of course, I grant you that many of them are not using it day to day for commerce yet, but they will. And there are examples of people, for example, even Bitcoin Beach in El Salvador. That's an example where Jack Mallers with Strike is using Lightning to enable people to pay with fiat and the other side to receive Bitcoin. And so the way
why would anybody do that? Why would anybody use Bitcoin given that, and this is the problem, I think, of it becoming a currency in the short run, is one of the requirements of being a currency that is not mentioned here because I don't think it was contemplated is its purchasing power has to be stable. And Bitcoin's purchasing power is anything but stable. It varies by the minute on a day. It's massively volatile. I'm sure people are using Bitcoin to buy and sell stuff. They're using it because they think it's cool. They're not using it because it makes any sense. It's not rational to use Bitcoin to transact today. If you believe it's going to be money one day, you should hold it because it's going to be worth $1 million of Bitcoin one day, right? And if you don't believe, then you should be selling it, right? So to actually transact it, it would have to have some kind of stability.
So let me respond to that a few different ways. So firstly, Bitcoin, as I was mentioning before, it's going to move through stages, right? I think for most people, it's going to be holding Bitcoin, right? It's going to be, you're holding this thing and you might do the Michael Saylor style, collateralize and borrow against your coins and spend the fiat. There are services now coming that allow this idea or another related idea. As I mentioned, Strike, this idea
Is that what Michael is doing? Make a Saylor? He's borrowing against this Bitcoin and spending the fiat?
Well, his example is a little different because he's borrowing fiat to buy more Bitcoin. But it's something that he's mentioned is this idea that you can just literally never spend your Bitcoin by just borrowing against it all the time, because you're taking advantage of the idea that, normal fiat credit is, call it 10, even if it was 10%, but Bitcoin, if it's doing 200% per year, well, obviously that's a huge, why would you?
I have to say, because I didn't know this, but I have to say that in any other market, I would say that is a number one sign of a bubble. When people are massively leveraging to buy and taking on lots of debt to buy, that is my indication of a bubble. Not quite, because my taxi driver is not buying Bitcoin yet. But although the guy who drives me to the airport was dabbling in Bitcoin, which led me to be suspicious a little bit. But when people start borrowing massively in order to buy, I get worried. But I don't own Bitcoin, so I'm not worried. But I would worry for the people who own it.
Well, I see it like
being removed, and again, not having any vested interest.
Okay, so let me respond there. So a few things there. Like I would say, people are in some sense trying to help adopt Bitcoin, and they're trying to essentially attack one currency and borrow the other. And you could think of it in that way. It's like so one of my friends, Pierre Richard, wrote a seminal article back in 2014 called Speculative Attack. And basically he was saying, if you look at how much Bitcoin is going up versus what the fiat interest rates are, of course it might make sense to do this, because by taking out a loan in fiat in a fractional reserve system, you're essentially helping inflate the fiat system even further. So you're kind of causing this sort of feedback loop of you buy this thing, and here's the other thing. I don't think it necessarily goes.
Now, when the velocity of money is so low and the banks are holding so much money on reserve, it's a blimp. I mean, if there was a big movement to crush the dollar, we'd all take out loans. It's not quite that simple.
So the way I think we can learn from this also is to look at what happens in high inflation scenarios. Now, I've done episodes on my show where I've interviewed people. Probably a good example is the one about When Money Destroys Nations. So that's a book. It's by Philip Haslam and Russ Lamberti, and they're talking about what happened in Zimbabwe, right? Obviously the high inflation, and they're talking about some of the different stages, if you will. Now, I'm not saying the world is going into hyperinflation tomorrow, but some of the principles that apply under a high inflation environment are still true, that people are trying to borrow in the weak money so that they can buy an asset.
Yep.
And I think that's what we're seeing as well, because the fundamental problem is that the money is broken. And so people are now, colloquially, this term, as I'm sure you know, is reaching for yield. They're reaching for stocks. They're reaching for property. They're doing something because they, the intelligent ones know they can't just leave their money in fiat. It's starting to go down quite a lot. And so I think of it like the world is slowly going to wake up to this idea that Bitcoin is that hard asset that you can't make more of. And there will just be more and more people trying to do this. Now, yes, some people will be irresponsible and borrow more than they are able to service in terms of their debt servicing cost. But for people who are intelligently navigating their way through the fiat standard, they will emerge, quite wealthy out of this, because they'll have a lot more Bitcoin in a world where Bitcoin is increasingly becoming the medium of exchange and unit of account, which we're not there yet, but I think that's the direction we're going.
Do you have a timeline? Do you have an expectation?
I think, call it 10, 15 years, something like that. So
I'll take that bet. I don't know what we should bet, but maybe $1 or
let's make a bet. I'm gonna email you in 5 years.
What's that?
I'm gonna email you in 5 years. What are you gonna bet on?
Sure, 5 years, 10 years, I'll take a bet on 10, 15 years. Because the fact is...
2026, Yaron Brook, what's going to be a Bitcoin price in US dollars? End of April 2006.
I don't know why the Bitcoin price is what it is today. I have no way. It's pure speculation from my perspective, so I have no idea.
Maybe percentage-wise.
I don't believe that in 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years, Bitcoin will be a dominant currency in the world. That's the bet I would take. I'm not going to bet on the price because I have no idea. But the question is, will it be a dominant currency that is used as a medium of exchange in the world? I would say the answer is no. And we could argue what dominant means, but I think we know dominant when we saw it, right? People choose to use Bitcoin when they go to buy assets or buy consumption goods. That's what money means, right? Otherwise, it's a hard asset, and it might be a hard asset. And I wouldn't. But it's not going to be money in the next 10, 15 years. Unless the only outcome I can see that would happen is if truly the dollar collapsed in the next 10, 15 years, which I'm skeptical of. But more than the dollar collapsed, governments, for some reason, were willing to give up control of banking. And I think the probability of that happening in the next 10, 15 years is basically zero or very close to zero. So, and again, even if that happened, I still think gold has a better shot than Bitcoin of surviving as the dominant money. But I just don't think the world is ready. I think I think hyperinflation, part of the lesson of Zimbabwe, you have to be careful with Zimbabwe, right? Because Zimbabwe didn't have inflation out of nowhere. It was an authoritarian regime that had confiscated assets, all the assets, all the land. It redistributed all the lands. It kicked out the productive, and it kicked out technology, and then inflated on top of all of that. Very unsophisticated. The worst case, you're seeing the same in Venezuela. It's associated with socialism. For better, for worse, the U.S. and the Western governments are far more sophisticated in the way in which they expropriate our wealth, right? Through fiat money and through other mechanisms. Their downfall will be a lot slower. It will be a lot, and it'll be much more. So we haven't gone through the authoritarian phase. I think we're heading there. But I think if the dollar collapsed tomorrow, I don't think the solution is more freedom. I think if the dollar collapsed tomorrow, the solution is going to be more authoritarianism. Not the solution I would want, but the solution that the world.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah.
What people and more authoritarians are not going to allow more Bitcoin. More authoritarians, an authoritarian government is likely to clamp down on Bitcoin and likely to replace the dollar with something that they can control.
So let me, a couple of points I think there. So I think you are very much right that there's a political, we have to understand the political circumstances of what happened in Zimbabwe. But I think it's also fair to say now, yes, it's fair to say, the US is a very different story, or the Western world is obviously a very different story to Zimbabwe. They have much more built up capital stock, so they can play these games for longer. They can try to kick the can for longer. But it is also important to remember in Zimbabwe, there was an entitlement culture. There was a high welfare. There was high debt. These were similar sort of circumstances. And also there is a brain drain factor. I think there will be jurisdictional competition. And what's different with Bitcoin is that there will be some areas that are very pro Bitcoin, and they will attract a lot of capital, entrepreneurs, employees, places like Miami, for example, or Wyoming, or potentially even Austin as examples in the US are probably some good examples where they may be able to successfully attract Bitcoin. And we may see, and that's just in the US. And also elsewhere around the world, we'll see other places that may be very suitable for Bitcoiners. For example, Singapore or Portugal with no capital gains tax. They may also be, in the end, suitable places. We may see this competition play out where, some governments, yes, are very anti-Bitcoin, but others are saying, hey, there's an opportunity here. The thing that's bad for you is actually good for me if I can play my cards well. And as an example, I would say, look at how some countries around the world are now actually starting to promote the idea of, hey, if you're a digital nomad, come and work in my country, right? Dubai has the virtual working program. I know Antigua and Barbuda has something similar. I know Indonesia are looking something similar. Estonia and some other places in Europe are talking about this. If they would try to say, hey, digital nomads, come here and work here, why would they not do the same with Bitcoin?
Well, so you missed the most important jurisdiction in the United States, which is Puerto Rico, which maybe has more Bitcoiners per capita than any place in the US. Brock Pierce is here, and he's created a whole big community of Bitcoiners around here. Is one of the Bitcoin billionaires, followed by scandal, but who knows? So. Look, my view is that one of the challenges, one of the differences between objectivists and libertarians is that I think ideas play a crucial role, philosophical ideas, not just political ideas. I don't think political ideas are that important because I think they're consequences of deep ideas. I think the deep ideas in the culture of the world today are fairly rotten, particularly the explicit ones as taught in universities and taught in the world. And that's true worldwide. I don't see that changing in the next generation. I don't think that changing in the next 15 years. Yes, there can be small movements towards more freedom because, we can make more money by being free and we can exploit these people a little bit more by giving them a little bit of freedom. But at some point, that's reined in. It always is. That's reined in because they recognize that, we don't want to give them too much freedom because that's dangerous. I don't think people learn from examples very well if they have a bad philosophy. So if they did, China would become Hong Kong, not Hong Kong, China. If they did, we would all have learned from West Germany, East Germany, and North and South Korea and everything else. But we're not. We're clearly not politically or philosophically. So, I'm more of, I don't like to call myself pessimistic because I'm not fundamentally pessimistic, but I do view ideas as driving history and ideas as driving where we're heading. For a while, Indonesia might play at attracting Bitcoiners. Hey, come over here. We'll let you do your thing. And then they'll regret it because they'll realize they lose control as a consequence and they'll clamp down on it because they're more fundamental. And the people, which is important because, as you said, in Uber, people said, no, we want this. You can't take it away from us. The people don't understand it. They don't get it. They don't care. They're quite happy with fiat currency for the most part, if it's reasonable, right? We don't necessarily, Zimbabwe is not a free country today because they went through hyperinflation. They're just a country without a currency. That uses South African rand and US dollars and still has an authoritarian regime and still has no private property and still has the same evils it had when it had hyperinflation. So it's not like people learn from hyperinflation, we should have freedom. We should get rid of central banks. Now, Zimbabwe got rid of the central bank because they had no choice because there was such a basket case. I don't see the West being that kind of basket case in 15 years, maybe one day. So again, I think We need to convince people that freedom is good, because most people don't think it is. We need to convince people that government control of the money is one of the ways that they control them, that they control the people, and therefore they should stop controlling the money. And if we achieve that, there'll be competitive, as we said before, there'll be competitive marketing currencies and let the best currency win. I don't think it can happen the other way around. I don't think the currency will just take over and then people say, oh, this is cool. I want to be free. Government, let this currency do it. That's not how history works. I don't know of an example of that ever happening. Oh, you're muted for some reason.
You did. Yaron, don't you think that there could be a technology that drives the change towards freedom? It doesn't necessarily have to be.
No, because freedom requires a change with regard to morality. It requires a change with regard to religion. It requires a change to the fundamental beliefs people have. You can go into a culture, and this is, you can go into cultures that don't have a respect, for example, for reason, and say, okay, everybody, you're free. And they'll slaughter each other. And that'll be their response to freedom. And that's the reality we see over and over again in history. So you need a set of ideas to establish freedom. And that set of ideas today in the world doesn't exist. And until it exists, the powers to be are not going to, and the people are not going to resist the powers to be, are not going to allow for that freedom.
So I agree with you that it is important for people like us to be out there like promoting this idea that freedom is good and you should cherish your freedom and you should respect other people's freedoms, very importantly, rather than, voting for or promoting statism and stealing other people's property and all that stuff, right, which we agree on. I just think of it like Bitcoin is this fundamentally world-changing technology in the sense that it's like it enables this kind of asymmetric defense, right? This idea that you can defend your property much cheaper. And so if we think back to books which you might have heard of, The Sovereign Individual, right? Like it's this idea that technology is changing the calculus of violence, right? It's this idea that now that this technology is here, more and more people can protect their value for the longer term. And that is just going to fundamentally change the relation of power that the states have with individuals like you and me. So I think probably the main point where I see it like where you were saying something like people don't learn from examples, right? So the hyperinflation and so on. I think in a monetary sense, some of them do, right? People who live in Argentina or Brazil, it's quite in their living memory that they had currency and monetary collapses. And so they start thinking more about, oh, hey, what hard assets can I use? Now,
you followed Argentina and the amount of bankruptcy they've had since the hyperinflation. And the amount
of course, I'm saying, well, of course, like I'm saying people in the country will care about.
Oh, yeah, so they've got their assets in dollars and gold or something, and they put it away and they've hidden it away something. But I still don't. But part of the reason they do that is they know that gold is usable. It's usable everywhere. Not gold, dollars are usable everywhere. And gold is, always usable in one way or another. I still haven't heard the case of why Bitcoin is usable. It's only usable if people want to use it. And the government of Argentina tomorrow can say you can't buy food with Bitcoin. You can use dollars, but you can't use Bitcoin.
So I think what happens over time is that there is only so much control and power that governments can exert, especially when there's enough people, right? So it's like the Uber effect, right? When there's enough people who just want this thing, no government is going to be able to stop that because politicians can only do what enough of the population supports them to do. So I see it like because Bitcoin is so important, because your money is so important, it's going to be the effect, that Uber effect is going to be magnified, right? Just you wanting ride sharing services is one thing, but you wanting to preserve your value is another altogether. And I think that will just fundamentally restrict or restrain governments longer term, right? I think for now, we're not at the numbers that it actually matters yet, but we may get there. And the way Bitcoin moves is it moves in these huge cycles, right? So we've historically seen these kind of 4-year cycles. And so the way I'm seeing it, I think this year we may see literally another 5 or 10x in the number of people who are, buying Bitcoin, holding Bitcoin, and eventually it reaches a point where, there's enough jurisdictions that are at least Bitcoin friendly, even if they're not fully zero tax or whatever, they're at least a little bit more friendly to it. And over time, it just erodes the power of government, because what's happening over time is this number is going up, right? The people holding Bitcoin, their value is going up, and the people holding fiat is going down. And so over time, the wealth of those Bitcoin holders is going to enable them to start doing things like lobbying or buying politicians and trying to get favorable laws, regulation, lower taxes, whatever. And of course, it won't be perfect, right? Like, it won't be the exact society that you or I would like, but I think it will have the net effect of making government smaller, because it will be much more expensive for governments to engage in the practices they have done, because up until now, they have been having this kind of bountiful benefit of cheap debt. In a world where we're living in a hard money world, and this might be, like I said, 15 years out, we don't know. But if essentially Bitcoin strips away that power of cheap debt for governments, because less and less people want to hold their money. And I think the important point here is there's like this kind of feedback loop, because the more people who opt out of the fiat system and buy Bitcoin, they're pushing even more of that debt cost onto the people who are remaining behind. So it's like a brain drain. It's kind of similar to that idea of the brain drain, right? A country, when the rich and the smart people leave the country because things are going bad, things are going south in that country, all the rich and the smart people leave, it makes it even worse.
They won't let it happen, right? It's exactly why the guns will come out, and they won't let it happen, because if you're going to create an economy that is a Bitcoin economy where you're not paying taxes because it's not being recorded, or you can easily evade taxes if you want to, and where they can't control the money supply and they can't sell their debt, they're going to shut you down, and they will shut you down quickly and effectively, because yes, people will run to another jurisdiction, but it's not like other jurisdictions in the world are run by benevolent dictators who have no problem with an alternative currency and don't want to take on any debt because they don't want to spend any money for their cronies. So yes, we could all huddle up in Singapore, the one place in the world that's had a relatively benevolent dictator, but not realistic. So it's a fantasy in my view to see that. I could see how you could build that world in an imaginary sense, but it's just not going to be allowed to happen. And the fact is that most people today who hold dollars don't have any problem holding dollars, don't care about the debt. Inflation in terms of the stuff that they buy on a day-to-day basis is very low. It's not high. It's not Zimbabwe, and it's not even anywhere close. It's probably less than 2%. Now that could change. Granted, that could change pretty quickly. But I think central banks know the danger of that, and they know how to deal with that. It's painful. But why would the average Joe ever care about Bitcoin, given that they're quite happy today? I don't think anybody out there is concerned about the value of the dollar, except some intellectuals like us and some economists out there. Not all economists. I mean, the most popular economic theory right now is modern monetary theory, right? That basically says, as long as there's excess capacity in the economy, you can print up as much money until that capacity gets used up, and then you can suck the money out of the economy if there's inflation by raising taxes, there's a truth to that, but it is nutty and offensive and rights violating and destructive. But most people don't care and have no clue.
So look, I think you and I are obviously very anti-MMT, but I think MMT it's one of those things where they get so much airtime on social media and on TV and things like that. But the actual, policy making people and the actual people in like central banks, they're not MMTers, right? Like they're kind of more bog standard, inflationist types. Obviously, again, you and I, obviously we disagree with them.
Feels that way these days. They are MMTs. I mean, we're getting one stimulus package after another, $5 trillion in the U.S. Infrastructure bills. Let's dig some holes and fill them up again. So it's kind of they don't like to call themselves MMTs, but they're stretch Keynesians, I guess. They're taking Keynesianism and stretching him to be.
Yeah, look, I agree with you there that in some, you can, certainly we can make that argument that it's like MMT, but not calling it MMT, right? They're giving people these checks and they're sort of related to like UBI, but not actually calling it UBI. Similar kind of thing. I see it though that your value, you're storing your value over time is very crucially important to us. And because Bitcoin is doing, on average, it's done 200% per year, it sooner or later becomes important for people to think about holding some. And, I don't know where that tipping point is. I couldn't tell you, but I think more and more people are going to learn about that. And of course, Bitcoin won't maintain 200% per year forever. Of course, nothing can. I mean, it's been going pretty wild, but I think it will obviously have to taper off at some point. But I think that point is nowhere near here. So I think it's just that.
But that's based on your belief that more and more people are buying into the idea that Bitcoin will be money one day. And I'm not convinced that there's a certain number of people that are convincible of that. And at some point that tapers off. And once people realize that tapers off, Bitcoin could lose. It could lose 200% a year, obviously, but it could lose 20, 30% a year for a few years at least and wipe out almost all the gains. It wouldn't take much to wipe out all those gains. I've seen it happen. You could have bought call options in the S&P 500 throughout the 80s and made 200, 300, 400% every year until you lost it all one year and literally went to zero. But that's what when I see 200% a year, I usually run for the hills. But that's just me. I still don't see the value. I see why Amazon does. I don't think 200% a year. I don't think anybody's ever done 200% a year for a long time. So I see the value creation. I know what value I get from it. I know what value it's created. I see the cash flows. I can justify it. Again, the justification to me for Bitcoin doing 200% a year is what I consider a fanciful view that it will become this prevalent, dominant form of medium of exchange. And I just still don't see the evidence that is going to happen.
Yeah. So let me outline a little bit around how I'm thinking of it. So it's not that I think, in that 10 or 15 years, Bitcoin will be the only money. I think we may be in a world where there's multi-currencies for a while. So the people who are running the US dollar, they want to kick the can as hard as they want to keep kicking that can. They want to keep the party going as long as they possibly can. Now, whether that means we're living in a world where, some people are, there's US dollar people, euro people, Japanese yen people, pound, whatever. And there'll be parallel, a whole Bitcoin economy sort of building up alongside as well. And so that's probably the main way I would see it. But I think, I think we're just going to have to agree to disagree on the whole 200% thing, because for me, I think that's just going to pull people in. And there will be a lot of people. And here's the way I would counter that, right? So, of course, fine. People who are intellectually reading, economics and trying to understand, of course, there's only so many of those people. But the reality is a lot of people just do what their family or their friends do. And they just kind of go like herd animals, right? So they just kind of, there'll be kind of those intellectual leaders or whatever, but then people will just follow them into it because they'll see it. And I think here's another important concept. I think it's that there's not really an alternative, right? Because if you want to, bonds are becoming incredibly, just a bad deal. Why would anyone voluntarily hold bonds? So then now people are looking at stocks and property. And now, and eventually it's going to reach a point where they'll just be forced into Bitcoin because there's no other thing that they can store their value or easily store their value in. That's how I see it. Because Bitcoin is liquid, right? It's really easy to trade that. Whereas obviously selling a property is not that easy. Now, maybe stocks would be the one thing that, this stock of Amazon is, equivalent, fungible, whatever. So I could see.
Stocks do very well during inflation, and not very well. Stocks hold their value in inflation, so
they do less bad than than normal than holding.
Yeah, and during the 70s, you didn't do great, but you didn't lose a lot of money holding stocks during inflation in the U.S. And in places that had 1,000% inflation, stocks went up 1,000%. So it actually acted as an inflation hedge during those periods. So. I worry about madness of crowds arguments. I mean, I get it that people follow the crowd. That's why GameStop, what happened with GameStop, happened with GameStop. But GameStop will, at the end of the day, trade at 20. And a lot of people lose a lot of money because that's its value. And, now your argument is, and I get it, that the value of Bitcoin is $1 million or whatever the number is. Because if it ever becomes the dominant money, then that's its value because it replaces all of the money. But it's relying on, I worry about relying on people's just doing it because their friends do it, because then they leave when their friends leave as well. And it doesn't take much to get people to sell off something they don't.
So why would they? So in that example, then why do you think, let's say people are continuing to adopt Bitcoin, and maybe it doesn't do 200%, but it slowly tapers off, like 150%, 100%, and so on until we get to that point. Why would people suddenly leave?
Oh, lots of reasons. The government's saying, this is anti-American to hold Bitcoin. It's we're not allowing you to buy physical assets with Bitcoin. You can't buy stocks. You can't buy thing. We're shutting down the exchanges in the US. Yes, you can trade with it other places, but just know that we consider it illegal and we're watching you. People would get scared, in spite of the anonymity. And we know Bitcoin's not as anonymous as maybe some would claim. And people would get scared and leave. I don't think it would take, I think it would be easy if you were in power to bring about a run on Bitcoin. I don't think it would be hard at all. And I think there's a lot of people that have an incentive to want to have a run on Bitcoin at some point. Particularly if you rely. Now, today you couldn't maybe form a run on Bitcoin because it's people like you and Michael Saylor and Elon Musk and real believers, right? And even then, I didn't quite get, maybe you could explain what's his name? Elon Musk's partner in PayPal, Peter Thiel. What Peter Thiel was talking about with China and Bitcoin, maybe you can explain that to me. I'm curious. But but even Peter Thiel, who's a maximalist, I think, or said he's a maximalist, was saying, well, China could manipulate this. Well, okay, if that's the case, there's another scaremongering tactic. So right now, maybe you couldn't get a run on Bitcoin because you've got a lot of true believers. But if you start now relying on not true believers, you start relying on the GameStop kind of people, then now it's not going to take much. It's going to take very little to get them to leave and to get them to escape the asset.
So the Peter Thiel thing, I think, there's all these different theories going, but people are saying, oh, it's 4D chess. He's doing like he's trying to, trying to encourage the US government and people in the US to sort of go hard on Bitcoin because they don't want China to go hard. And maybe there's like a jealousy plot line or something that he's trying to run there. I don't actually know, like, to be honest. I think at the end of the day,
imagine the Vatican came out and said it's wrong for Catholics to hold Bitcoin. I mean, you laugh. Crazier things in the world have happened.
Okay, fair enough. But I think it just,
that's the rule of idea.
We've got to look at what's likely, though. Don't forget, the House of Representatives of Louisiana came out commending Bitcoin. We've got some places that are very much pros and supporting this thing because they want to compete against the other states. I just don't see it like
revenue people from Louisiana. They'll change them very quickly if they discover it's going to reduce their revenue.
I think they could see it like, we want to compete against other states, and we know that where things are going are just where they're going. So the other important, I think, example is that oftentimes once somebody in an organization gets orange pilled, then they try to turn their organization to actually support Bitcoin or try to benefit from it, right? So Michael Saylor goes and tries to he gets orange pilled, and then he goes to orange pill the rest of his board and his executives, and then they go hard buying Bitcoin. And then I think it'll be a similar story with all sorts of, whether it's a small private company, it's high net worth office, family office, whatever, funds. I think a similar story could even happen with governments as well, where people inside the government get orange pilled and then they start thinking, hey, you know what? This is actually an important freedom technology. And people even like Neil Ferguson, like I've interviewed Neil Ferguson, the historian, on my show. And he mentioned as well that there's this idea of a more decentralized money than what the sort of Chinese social credit system is offering us. And Bitcoin might offer that kind of potential where, okay, yeah, it's not 100% anonymous, but it's not 100% transparent either, depending on how you use it. And it might provide a more decentralized way. And actually, there are people arguing that it is more of it's more American to support the idea of Bitcoin. So who knows?
Absolutely. It's not more American to support the idea of Bitcoin. It's more American to support the abolition of a central bank and to have competitive currencies. And again, let Bitcoin win in that case if it's the best. But if Neil Ferguson was influential, the world would be a better place. We'd be at a better starting point, but he's not. So that's part of our challenge, right? And the problem is that the people influential on the left and on the right are basically all statists, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. And they basically don't want to give up that kind of control. Now, again, I'll go back to my original argument that as long as it's not a marketable commodity, as long as it doesn't have a use beyond money, I don't think it'll win in the battle for money in a free market. Now, we don't have a free market, so maybe it wins because it's better at undermining fiat currency than anything else, maybe. But it would be interesting to run the experiment of a true free market and let the entrepreneurs go at it at money and see what happens.
That's an interesting. Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting idea. And I know obviously Hayek talked about, the denationalization of money and this whole idea of competitive monies. I think at the end of the day now, Bitcoin has sort of shown that, well, maybe we don't need that. We just have this one money and it's just the open standard that everyone joins. And not everyone in the Bitcoin world is actually a libertarian, right? There are a lot of people who actually, some of them are even more on the left side. Although I would say they're a little bit more left libertarian than they are left authoritarian, right? The kinds of people who are into Bitcoin tend to be more, pro liberty values, even if they're not necessarily the right-wing libertarian like I am. So yeah, I think the other important point is that, how has gold done to all of this? Well, gold hasn't exactly gone up a lot compared to some of the other commodities and property or stocks or other things that people could be invested in.
I think people don't see inflation. They don't see price inflation right now. They don't see the weakness in the dollar that kind of the quantity theory of money would suggest would happen. Because I have a theory about that. It's a theory. There are smarter economists than me, I'm sure, would disagree. But I think we've lost the ability in the world in which we live right now to measure the quantity of money and to understand the quantity of money. I don't think economists know how to measure the quantity of money given what the Fed is doing, given zero interest rates. Zero interest rates create a very interesting environment in which a lot of things become money that wouldn't be money if interest rates were higher. Like bonds, I think, become money because at zero interest rate, they're exchangeable. For example, during the financial crisis, people saw the Fed print huge amounts of money and they thought the amount of money in the economy was growing. But if you actually look at some money aggregates, some of the money aggregates were actually shrinking dramatically during the financial crisis. Same during the Great Depression. Money aggregates shrunk dramatically during the Great Depression. One of the reasons it was a depression. So it's not easy to figure out what money aggregate to use, what money aggregate to look at. And that is an evolving thing because of the way the financial system works. It's not as simple as it used to be when the Austrians were writing, the original Austrians were writing, where it was banks and making loans, which created, and the Fed. And today it's so much more complex than that because the number of money substitutes in the economy is just astronomical. And yet it's also true that money is not circulating in much. Debt creation, there's very little debt creation. The Federal Reserve, most of the money it's printing is sitting at reserve at the Federal Reserve. So it's not in the economy even. It's back at the Federal Reserve. So it's just a kind of a shell game. The Fed plays a shell game that benefits financial assets, but almost nothing else. There's a lot of stuff going on that economists have yet to grapple with, and that gives modern monetary theory, quote, credibility, quote, right? Because
free ride a bit. They kind
better
of get
economists, the Chicago School and the Austrians are not very good at predicting where the world will go.
So I think you're right that the government and many of the central banks they play this whole game of obfuscation. But that was similar to what happened in the Zimbabwe story. They, as things start to get worse, they try to obfuscate how much money creation is going on. And you're right that there is, and funnily enough, I did an episode with Kate Lalong on this idea of what did Austrians miss, and she made a really interesting point. She was saying if Rothbard were alive today, he would have written, instead of The Mystery of Banking, he would have written The Mystery of Shadow Banking. He would have written about, how, as you're saying, there's like this shadow banking system and that there's like a creation of money or moneyness as well, this idea that...
That would suggest that there's even more money than what we see. And given the movements in prices, that it doesn't seem real, right? Because if all of that were true, inflation should be 5, 6, 7, 8%, no matter how you measure it. And if there's almost no measure of inflation that shows that. And if you take into account increased productivity and take into account technology, you could argue that for much of the last 20 years, inflation's been negative. Price inflation, we're not monetary inflation, price inflation has been negative. So I think there's still a lot Austrians can go out and figure out because they don't quite get it yet. Because there's something going on that's more complicated than that. I have a theory about it. One is that because the dollar is a global currency, it's the currency on a global scale. One has to take into account increases productivity on a global scale, and productivity increases on a global scale have been massive, and therefore that in a static money supply would have driven prices way down. I mean, dramatically down. So the fact that we're stable means there's been inflation, but it's relative to downward slope.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And the effect of China and India, globalization and all of that have basically driven price inflation out of the equation because of the increased productivity in these countries. But I don't see any literature on that and that being quantified. I wish it was, because I think we're letting, unfortunately, this is to the Austrian economists out there, I think you're letting MMT, the BS that is MMT, dominate the airwaves because we're not giving a good explanation for what has happened in the last 30 years in the US economy.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. But I mean, I've seen, for example, Bob Murphy's critique of the MMT book, Stephanie Kilton's book, The Deficit Myth. And I think the key point that I took from his critique was that, at the end of the day, people can switch monies, right? So while the MMT people sort of think, oh, see, we've got you trapped in here, but ultimately it matters if you are a monetary sovereign. You are the creator of the money that you use, right? So Argentina are not the creators of the money that they use. They have to borrow from the US, and then boom, now you're feeling the cost of that interest. So yep. I think the way it's going to happen is more like a lot of people will just run into Bitcoin, and then eventually governments around the world will not be the sovereign because eventually people will just want to hold Bitcoin. And that I think that is the main mechanism by which governments will be forced smaller. But I think to the point you were making earlier around, not having a good conception of what's going on with inflation and deflation, I think, there are a lot of people who have been speaking about it, but I think it's just difficult to quantify because it's kind of like that. It's below the iceberg. It's the iceberg. What we're seeing is just that bit above the water. But really, because of all that productivity growth, the real price inflation should be negative, right? And so I think that's the way, if I were to think back to my interview with Michael Saylor as well, he thinks of it like, hey, there's different buckets. You might think of it like there's one bucket of things where because it's digital, it's almost free, or the cost is getting cheaper and cheaper, it's free, yep. Or some things are getting really, really cheap and they're just staying super cheap because it's digitally delivered, the scale, all of that, right? And then you got some consumer good things where maybe, or whatever, food, maybe it's not going up that much. But then if you look at all the things that rich people want to buy, whether that's luxury property, luxury or private education for their schooling for their children, and artwork and things like that, all those are going at 15 or 20%. And we are hitting a point where I think property markets around the world in certain places are just going crazy. So that's a lack of supply driven by government regulations. I mean, and the same with education. It's the free loans that the government provides. So, and the same with medical care. Anything the government touches. And it's why, you'll see people moving. It's why Miami's doing well and why Austin is doing well, because as high as prices are in Miami and Austin, they're really low compared to California. And people are leaving California and going there because there's less of an issue of supply and demand. But it still doesn't, there are few areas in which prices have gone up a lot, but we're still not in a inflationary environment. And it's true, rich people are the ones that consume these goods more than others. But rich people don't change the world.
Gentlemen, for sure we can see that it's not decided yet whether money of the future or maybe not, if probably the price wouldn't be so low. Some argue that this $60,000 pretty low. But I also wonder, like, if we could name Bitcoin technology inherently driving change towards freedom, because, well, we can say that there are certain institutions that do that, like globalization, privatization, sound money, decentralization. Those are the institutions which, well, maybe not necessarily, but throughout our history, they move the world toward more free place for individuals. And Bitcoin encapsulates those characteristics. Yaron, what do you think? Is this just a tool that could be used also for evil, or maybe we actually need only ideas and do not support technology which may change the future?
I think institutions follow ideas. So globalization doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because certain ideas become prevalent and people open up. That's why you had globalization in the 19th century, because the ideas of Adam Smith and the ideas of the Enlightenment and the ideas of trade and openness and treating people as individuals became dominant. And that's why you saw hunkering down post World War I and during the Great Depression, you saw hunkering down against globalization, so reversal because the world moved towards authoritarianism. You saw an opening up of globalization after World War II in the West. And that seems to have ended. Today, both left and right in the United States and in many other countries, including your Poland, are moving away from a view of globalization, free movement of capital, labor, and goods, and becoming much more nationalistic. So you're seeing a movement away from that. So I think institutions and technology are great. I love technology, but they are results of freedom. They are results of good ideas. And when ideas turn bad, they are the victims of those ideas. And look, I don't think we'll ever see Rome again in a sense of the defeat of Rome and the collapse of Rome. But remember that Rome had amazing technologies. And all those technologies disappeared like that, right? Now, I hope that it never happens again. And I truly believe it won't, because I think knowledge today is diffused in a way that it wasn't during Rome. It was concentrated, and the diffusion of knowledge is crucial. I don't see Uber as educating people towards more freedom. Since Uber became a dominant technology, we elected Donald Trump and Joe Biden, two anti-freedom as presidents as we've ever had in the United States of America. So I don't think that technology drives politics. I don't think Uber will drive a movement to be more free, because I think freedom is dependent on values that people have to choose that precede and are more important to them than Bitcoin. As I said before, if somebody like Donald Trump said Bitcoin is un-American, some people, not everybody obviously, but some people would sell Bitcoin, would get out of Bitcoin immediately. They'd say, oh my God, I don't want to be anti-American. Because their Americanism, if you will, is more important to them than the 200% that Bitcoin might increase the next year. There are values that are deeper for people, and until you change those values, the lesson of communism hasn't been learned as certain countries in Eastern Europe are experimenting more and more with authoritarianism. And you lived it through communism, right? You should know better, but it doesn't. I haven't
been born yet.
Not you. I don't mean you personally. I mean you as representing Eastern Europe. And you as representing all young people who today clamor for socialism as if it's never been tried, as if they are the first generation to discover socialism. And if they want it, it's been tried, it's failed over and over and over and over. Until you challenge the underlying premises of socialism, the underlying ideas of socialism, no technology will move us away, cause them to move away from it. Now, it helps. That is, people experiencing the freedom of technology helps at the margin, but it doesn't fundamentally change.
Well, maybe so here's where I might. Yeah. Let me just add a point here. I would say, you know how people talk about how politics is downstream of culture, right? I think there are cultural consequences of fiat money, and I think the broader adoption of Bitcoin will change some of that culture because, you now, like, I think of it like fiat money and the government interventions are sort of removing the consequences of our long-term actions. And so what that does is stops us, it sort of nullifies that cost of what we normally would have paid. And so in a hard money world, you're being forced to pay that cost now. So that will change the culture, and I think that will then in turn change some of the politics. So I guess that's how I'm viewing this kind of transition happening. Now, I could be wrong on the timeline, right? Maybe 15 years is too short. It's actually 50 years away. But the way I'm seeing it, it's like as the world returns to a hard money, whether that's Bitcoin or gold, I think it will have cultural consequences relative to what we have now. And that will in turn have political consequences.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking
that
maybe...
Question for you, Stephan, from my super chat.
There is questions actually also from Zoom, so that's my...
So how does Bitcoin solve the issue of price discovery? When you buy a product via Bitcoin, the buyer doesn't know how much exactly he is paying, and the seller doesn't know how much he's getting. Is that a problem in terms of price discovery?
So I'm not clear that, because currently... Right, okay. So I would say for now, most people who are transacting with Bitcoin have become comfortable with just dealing with that volatility. They just basically write it for the long term, or they are using a payment processor who automatically dumps it for fiat, basically. So they are really just selling, say, 10 Australian dollars worth, but whatever that is in Bitcoin terms. So whatever, if that is, 8,000 Satoshis or whatever it is, that's kind of the way they're doing it right now. But longer term, yeah, I see it like this is all a function of Bitcoin being small. And as it rises, as it becomes bigger, then it will be less and less volatile.
We also have questions on Zoom. There is a lot of comments, but people on Zoom who are with us, people on Facebook, you can join us at zoom.laissezfaire.pl. You can raise your hand on Zoom or post the question in the comment sections. I will let you in with the video, and hopefully we will your beautiful faces asking good questions. Yeah, I was thinking after Yaron's comment that maybe actually Bitcoin is the product of these ideas, and maybe is finally the technology which encapsulates, as I mentioned before, decentralization, globalization, privatization, sound money. And maybe we don't know who created it exactly, who Satoshi Nakamoto was, but it is almost clearly that Bitcoin was created by people who respected transparency, who respected privatization, who didn't like central banks, who were cypherpunks, and didn't want government to know what you own and how do you communicate with other people. Also today, I can see that a lot of Bitcoin community, the core Bitcoin Twitter community, is very libertarian, and it became more and more the previous year. So yeah, I give it a lot of hope, and I guess like.
So as you know, Tomek, I just have to say this for the record. I'm not a libertarian. I'm certainly not an anarchist. I reject anarchism quite seriously. I think it's an anti-liberty thing. So I just want to make clear that because there's too much danger of lumping us together here.
Of course, disclaimers. Also, whatever we talk here, it's not financial advice of any sort. Do you have question from Zoom? Nikos has a question. Nikos, please unmute yourself and welcome to the...
Yeah, thanks to both. This question is not... I'm not asking for financial advice. I'm just curious. So I cannot understand the situation. Two things I cannot understand the situation with gold. The first is why it's not skyrocketing way more than Bitcoin if the reason that Bitcoin goes up is that people are worried about inflation. So you'd expect that some people would go to gold, some people would go to Bitcoin. But why do we see the rise in Bitcoin and not so much on gold and silver? And the second question is, okay, if someone has gold for a situation of emergency, isn't it basically a situation where even gold is not going to get you that far because you are in a situation where what are you going to do? You're going to buy bread or you're going to buy rice with gold? It's already going to be so bad that probably the thing that you need more is a house in the mountain and guns. So,
I mean, I'll give you a best attempt at both of those. First, I don't think Bitcoin is viewed as a hedge on inflation. I think Bitcoin is viewed as the most rational explanation, as money one day. And every time somebody like Michael Saylor or Elon Musk says they're using Bitcoin, that gives it more credibility. And if it is money, if it's going to replace all the money in the world, then you need to take the value of all money in the world and divide it by the number of potential Bitcoins. And that will be a number, and that number is way higher than 60,000. So it's being driven by, in that sense, true believers and people who believe in it as money. It's not being driven as a hedge for inflation. Now, part of the idea of it being adopted as money is the idea that we're heading towards hyperinflation, the collapse of the dollar, the complete disintegration of the dollar goes away, and therefore there'll be a desire to replace it with something, and Bitcoin will step in. And if that's the case, then it's worth a lot more than 60,000. So I don't think you can compare the two, because I think the motivations to buying the two right now, at least, are very, very different. And that's why you're seeing different rates of acceleration. And then in terms of gold, no, I mean, I think if the world collapsed tomorrow, people always want gold, not reasons of it can be used in electronics, because electronics there's no electronics industry, in a collapsed world, but because gold has always been valued primarily for jewelry, and primarily because people assume that other people will want it as well. That is, that it is a medium of exchange. And that there's always somebody who'd want it for its end use, but in the meantime, it's used as a medium of exchange. And it's been proven throughout history that people are willing to use it for that. And one of the ways in which you're going to get weapons in a house in the mountains is by buying them with gold in that kind of scenario.
There is next question from Sergiusz.
What up, guys? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, but we're seeing Nico, so we haven't. Have we moved?
Yep.
Anyway, I don't know. Go ahead, Sergey.
Right. Good to see you guys. Yaron, you like managed to last 1 hour 22 minutes by saying you're not a libertarian. So I'm proud of you, bro. Good to see you all. And Yaron, I got a question to you because like you're claiming that people are not really aware of the whole monetary system, the clue. But don't you think of a bit just simply as a tool of spreading the libertarian, like the freedom ideas, call it which ones? Just to the new people, to the people, high quality people like Tom and like Stephan, because like right now we got the millions of people that are able to get in touch with those ideas, like the whole Bitcoin manifesto and stuff like this. So I'm just saying that from that perspective, or just from the perspective of a person who wanted to achieve the goal, it's pretty nice question. My question to you is simple: are we able to use Bitcoin in your store, in your shop, Yaron, online? Are we able to purchase your products with cryptocurrencies? Thanks so much.
I don't know. I think so. I think we started a wallet and we made it possible. But I'm going to tell you, I'm going to convert it into dollars immediately, because I don't know, and I'm not going to hold an asset that I don't know what it's worth. I don't believe it's going to become money, so I don't do that division that would explain the 200% increase. I invest in things. To me, Bitcoin is an asset. It's not money. Nobody's convinced me it's money yet. It isn't used as money, and it's not a commodity. So those are the things that, to me, still, it's got some of the other characteristics that are good, but as long as it's not a commodity, I don't see it as money. But I think it's an investable asset. If somebody asked me, in a particular context, I think holding a basket of cryptos as in a diversified portfolio as an asset class is not necessarily a bad idea. I'm older than you guys, and as such, I tend to, and somebody's going to call me a boomer in a minute, but I happen to be at the tail end of the boomer generation. But I have seen technologies come and go. I've seen technology replaced. I'm not willing to say Bitcoin won the crypto wars. I think it's way, way too early to say that. I don't see anything metaphysically different between Bitcoin and what could be produced. Now, maybe none of the cryptos right now is anywhere close to Bitcoin, but I don't see anything stopping somebody from creating something as good as Bitcoin. It would be nice if somebody created something as good as Bitcoin and that had a use, because I think if you gave it use, like for example, Ethereum, the supposed use, and again, I'm not an expert, so I don't know if this is true, is contract validation, right? It's smart contracts. So that gives it value above and beyond its use as money. Now it's got other flaws, as Stephan says. Maybe it's a lousy money, fine. But the point is, could you make a Bitcoin use? This is the first money you're claiming is not a use, and it's still not money because it's still not being used. So that's why I would sell it immediately if I got it. It's complicated. That's why I have a hard time in terms of, I mean, I'm sure I could learn it and figure it out if I were motivated. But creating a liquidity would sustain itself, that would be true. But I want liquidity out today. So, yes.
Yeah. So I think the other point I would just make is that I think, obviously, that's our main disagreement here, is that you think it needs a non-monetary use, and I think it doesn't need that. And I think that it can be successful. If anything, it might make it more clarified as a money, because that is what it's mainly used for. And also, I just want to make it clear that there are certain parts of the world where, for example, Bitcoin Beach in El Salvador, there is like a whole town of people who are all using Bitcoin transactions over the Lightning Network. And they are doing it literally for day-to-day commerce. There are people who earn sats and they spend sats to buy bread or milk and things. So in certain contexts, it already is used as money. It's just not all around the world. And, I'm prepared to wait and see. And I think that's really where people and listeners have to make their own decision. Are they willing to, do this idea of speculate on this future adoption, or think of it as like a long-term savings technology? That's how I view it.
I also think that eventually, each of us, some Bitcoiners already faced the choice which money they want to use. Either the money created by the government to finance the war and used to finance the war and under control of politicians and central bankers, or the money designed to be a sound money, used by free people, adopted by a choice, and under your private control. So I hope there will be a time where also Yaron will face this choice, and it will be possible to people who are still skeptic today that they could convert into Bitcoin economy. And since we have more and more possibilities to either earn in Bitcoin or spend Bitcoin, it will drive adoption up as well. Also quicker among the people who value freedom.
Again, I think you underestimate the enemies of freedom. You underestimate their power. You underestimate their commitment to stopping you from it. And I don't think Bitcoin protects you from that.
Maybe you underestimate humanity and Bitcoin communities. We have questions from audience. Adam Reed.
I'm thinking of Bitcoin as cooperative equity, and as an investment, I compare it to other equities on the market rather than thinking of it as a medium of exchange. And while this is not an area in which I want to invest my equity funds, I prefer to invest in anti-aging companies. It's an enterprise, and equities are a hedge against inflation. So why wouldn't people who think that's the best hedge use it for that?
So what are you buying an equity in? That is, what is the productive function that you're buying? So you buy equity in Amazon, you're buying equity in a company that has assets and has cash flow. What is it you're buying equity in? What is the equity in? What does it represent?
The equity represents a symbolic ledger, and as long as there are buyers and sellers, it's a product, and it's made by somebody, and the people who make it contribute to equity that you can buy.
But what you're buying is the product. Because what they're producing are Bitcoins, and Bitcoin is the equity in the Bitcoin manufacturing. It's a bit, I guess I don't get it. We're back to me not getting it.
Well, again, I'm not investing in it personally, but if I were to invest, I would consider it more as an equity than as, let's say, a medium of exchange.
But that's what I call it, an asset. I think it's more, that's why I said it's an asset. It's not medium of exchange. I don't think it's money yet. Maybe it will be one day, but it's not yet. Somebody's producing it, right? Somebody's mining it. So, and those entities have.
I just noticed that my mic was not on the stream, but that's fine. Leo Vinia is with us also. I hope I pronounced his name correctly.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Hey, Yaron. I discovered your channel recently, so big fan. So my question.
Whoops.
You keep bringing up. Oh, is it better now?
Yep.
Yeah, my Wi-Fi is a bit choppy. So you keep bringing up basically like, governments will resist putting restrictions. And my question would be, what is the alternative as, because my view is that Bitcoin is the most secure asset that is unfeasible by any coercion. And so, you might say, okay, the US people, like, it's not terrible compared to like other countries. So what if you're living, in Greece or like where they seized assets or totalitarian governments, right? And, potentially maybe it kind of happened in the US, Ayn Rand writes about it, Atlas Shrugged. So what would be an alternative? And do you think if there were like a massive wealth tax, for example, right? Whether it's through inflation or through some totalitarian government, what would be the alternative to protect your assets?
Well, it's not that I think there's an alternative to protect your assets. It's that I think that at the end of the day, Bitcoin will not protect your assets. That is, at the end of the day, either while the government can't literally confiscate your Bitcoin, they can make it almost impossible for you to use it, and they can penalize you for using it. And that's what they will do if they think that you're using Bitcoin in order to escape their, imagine if they institute a wealth tax tomorrow. Imagine if Elizabeth Warren's plan is instituted. And as a response to that, everybody who has wealth, I think the plan is anybody over $30 million gets taxed. Everybody with over $30 million takes all their money above 30 million, buys Bitcoin with it. I mean, Stephan will become a gazillionaire if that happens, right? Because Bitcoin will go through the roof. But what would the US government do? Will the US government just say, oh, shit, we messed up. We can't tax your wealth anymore. We'll think of something else. We'll go do something else. No, I mean, I don't know exactly what they'll do, but they're not going to play nice, right? So I'll give you an example. One of the founders of Facebook, I think it was Facebook, before the company went public, gave up his US citizenship, went to Singapore, made all the money in capital gains, right? And didn't pay any US taxes. And immediately the United States Senate came into session and passed a law, the law that's on the books right now, that basically says that if you give up your American citizenship, there will be an audit of your assets, immediate audit of your assets, and they will be taxed as if you were liquidating it. So all the capital gains and all future capital gains that are expected, or I don't know exactly how it works, but they're going to penalize you dramatically. Now, I don't know how they're going to go after Bitcoin. I'm not saying I have the answer, but they are going to try. And that effort, that attempt, and if it's sustained, will have a dramatic negative impact on the value of Bitcoin.
I think what Stephan was bringing up was that, because the alternative right now, for example, would be a bank account where you can always freeze it. Versus here, I would say, liquidate your assets in Bitcoin, hop on a plane, memorize 24 words, and you can be like, I don't care about your exit tax, basically, if you're in a non-extradition.
I wish we all lived in a world where you could hop on a plane and go wherever you wanted. We don't.
But
soon you're gonna have to show you're vaccinated. Not only do you have an actual passport, but you have to. You guys underestimate the power of the statists. You underestimate the power of government and the extent to which they are intent on not losing control over wealth, over their ability to tax you, over your citizenship. One of the reasons I oppose a wall on the southern border, other than I'm pro-immigration generally, is because walls can be used to keep people in. And the United States government has shown a willingness to, in a sense, erect walls to keep people in. This Senate bill is a tax to keep you from leaving. So all I'm saying is, life is, these things are more complicated and harsher than you make them seem, and you're not fully protected with Bitcoin. Now, there might be ways to protect yourself, but those, you have to think them through, you have to have a plan, you have to get an escape route, you have to have all of that. It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. I'm not saying the status of one, by the way. I'm saying the only
definitely sounds like it.
Somebody's writing here that I'm saying the status of one. I'm not saying the status of one. I'm saying that the only way to defeat the status is to defeat the statists. That is to go after them and to convince people that they are bad. Now, to the extent that Bitcoin is a tool in convincing them, cool. I'll use any tool I can. So I'm not against using tools, but we have to convince people that statism is bad before we can be free. We're not going to be free. I'm not moving to El Salvador to the beach. I mean, I did to Puerto Rico, but there've been little communities that use barter in the modern world, little communities that are being run like communist communes in the world. So little communities don't do anything. Don't prove a point.
One difference though is, I would say it's not just this little, community. It's actually that they're interoperable with the rest of the world. We're building this kind of digital nation, if you will, a kind of everyone can participate and trade in this world. And, it allows people to have that kind of digital gold aspect or digital goods and services sales online. That's one example. But I would say to this whole question of, have the status won? And certainly it's important to sort of fight that battle of ideas. I agree with you there. I just see it like you want, the people who believe in, I think, of course, libertarians and objectivists have their disagreements, but in some ways we have some element of fellow traveler, like we have some element of similar things that we're looking at and that we want, and that we would rather have those people get some wealth and then use that wealth to, try to drive change and try to change the way people think. So that's how I would think about it.
Well, I mean, I think I would say that Bitcoin is money when Bitcoin is used as money. That is not on a large scale. I don't think I have that much power or influence, Tomek. So I wouldn't put all that weight on me. It doesn't. As I said, it doesn't make any sense to me. And in a true free market competition, I think that something, whatever it happens to be, that has a commodity feature to it, is going to beat Bitcoin in the end. Whether that is gold, that is